Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you around the world, and welcome to the last day of the annual meeting of the ABA International Law Section's annual meeting, The Americas and Beyond, Navigating Legal Changes and Challenges. I'm Joe Rea, the chair of the section, and today you will find another day of extraordinary speakers and world leaders. I want to begin by sending greetings and thanks to the platoon of Latin American law firms who are sponsoring our in-house council plenary session. They are exceptional leaders in their region and extraordinarily responsive. Thanks again. I also want to say a special thank you to our friend and colleague, Jonathan Granoff, who is bringing us another historic figure today, Prime Minister Kim Campbell. Some years ago, Jonathan left full-time practice of law to pursue a calling, worldwide nuclear non-proliferation. That calling introduced him to world leaders, Nobel Peace Prize winners, and many other eminent thinkers and doers. That calling also enabled him to build these extraordinarily rich relationships and to share them with us in his many, many interviews. The significance of the interview you're about to see today is reflected by the president of the ABA, Trish Rifo. Once again, Trish has agreed to join us and to introduce Jonathan and the Prime Minister. Thank you, Trish. Thank you for your leadership, your support, and your friendship. And now, here is the president of the ABA, Trish Rifo.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for your leadership of our terrific section. It is my great honor today to introduce a remarkable role model and champion of the rule of law, the Right Honourable Kim Campbell, former Prime Minister of Canada. Prime Minister Campbell is a true leader among world leaders. She was designated by the National Geographic Almanac of World History as one of the 50 most important political leaders in world history. Kim Campbell's career is unique and inspiring. Not only was she the first woman Canadian Prime Minister, but she was also the first to have served in all three levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal. As the former Minister of National Defense, she is the first woman to hold the top defense position in any NATO country. She has also held cabinet portfolios as Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Minister of State for Indian Affairs and Northern Development, and Minister of Veterans Affairs. After her tenure as Prime Minister, Kim Campbell served as a diplomat and then as an educator at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She now serves as chairperson of the Independent Advisory Board for the Supreme Court of Canada Judicial Appointments, which advises the Prime Minister on Supreme Court appointments. A respected member of a very small club of women former heads of state, Kim Campbell has led a number of global organizations, including the Council of Women World Leaders, the International Women's Forum, the International Crisis Group, World Movement for Democracy, and the Climate Action Reserve. Her many honors include the Companion of the Order of Canada, which is the nation's highest civilian honor. She earned her bachelor's and law degrees at the University of British Columbia and a doctorate in Soviet government at the London School of Economics. Joining Prime Minister Campbell today as interviewer is an accomplished ABA member and leader, Jonathan Granoff. Jonathan is president of the Global Security Institute and serves as senior advisor to the ABA's Committee on National Security. This dialogue with Prime Minister Campbell is part of a series Jonathan initiated decades ago with such notables as Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and William Perry, as well as UN Messengers of Peace, Jane Goodall and Michael Douglas. We can be assured of a lively and substantive discussion on matters of importance not only to all lawyers, but to all who appreciate and champion the critical role of the rule of law in free societies. So, Prime Minister Campbell, Jonathan, on behalf of the American Bar Association, thank you so much for being with us today, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. President Rifo, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And now I have the pleasure of just jumping right in as fast as possible into a dialogue with the Right Honorable Kim Campbell, who has been an inspiration in my life. I first met Prime Minister Campbell at the State of the World Forum, which was part of the Gorbachev Foundation in the 1990s, when it was clear that she was moving from being a leader of her country to being a global thought leader. And in the period of after her being prime minister, she helped create the Club of Madrid, which is she was the leader of World Leaders, which is an organization of former heads of state and heads of government focused on advancing democracy and the rule of law. She's been a leader in numerous organizations, the Crisis Group, women's leadership groups, and has actually worked tirelessly for not just the good of Canada, not just the good of women, but for the good of the whole human family. And in that regard, she is a role model. And even in education, she was a fellow and taught at Harvard, and even created a university program, which you will talk about, to analyze and then how to create leadership. So she's an expert in the theory and practice of leadership. So Prime Minister Campbell, where did you grow up?
That's assuming I did. I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia, on the West Coast. I'm a post-war baby boomer, and it was a sleepy little provincial city in those days. It's grown into a really wonderful city, center of the movie industry, software, all that kind of stuff. But I had a pretty idyllic upbringing. And I should just say that when I was at the Kennedy School and would complain about the snow in Boston, people would say, well, you're a Canadian, you should be used to, like, oh, no, I'm from the Banana Belt. I'm from the warm part. So I grew up in that temperate part of Canada where the Japanese current in the Northern Pacific keeps you from the terrible vagaries of winters in other parts of my country.
At some point, it must have dawned on you that you had a destiny beyond just this so-called sleepy town in the western part of Canada. When did it dawn on you that you could, I mean, at that time, there weren't many women role model leaders of the caliber that you've achieved. When did it dawn on you that you would venture into something so ambitious as the course of your life has demonstrated?
Well, you know, Jonathan, I'm a post-war baby boomer, and both my parents were in uniform in World War II. In fact, I'm talking to you from Italy, where my father fought and was wounded. This was the longest Canadian campaign was in Italy, when it started in 1943. His best friend lies in a grave in Ravenna. My mother horrified her mother by enlisting in the Navy to become a Wren. Nice girls didn't go in the Navy, but my mother did, and she trained as a wireless operator and tracked the transmissions of German U-boats in the North Atlantic and Gulf of St. Lawrence. So I grew up in a family where both my parents had been in uniform in World War II, but also for those of us who are baby boomers, World War II was sort of everywhere. It was on the TV, it was in the movies. It was one of the greatest cataclysms that had happened in world history. And I guess I wanted to be part of some process that would help keep that from happening again. So I always felt, because just as my parents had served, that I wanted to do something beyond just my own immediate life, to be part of something bigger, because I was really, really often kind of almost obsessed with what it meant. And I would think about, all the people who had died, and that they were just people like me with the same kind of consciousness, and they didn't get a chance to survive. I read a lot about the Holocaust. So I wanted to be a force for something good, something peaceful. I wasn't quite sure how to do that. And when I was a teenager, I thought, oh, I would love to be the first woman Secretary General of the UN, but I didn't know how that happened either. But I should also say, as you'll hear, I said that I wanted to be the first woman. My mother raised my sister and me to believe that girls could do anything, but to understand that that wasn't a universally accepted proposition. And we had a wonderful woman who was the first female mayor of Ottawa, Charlotte Whitten. And she once said that a woman had to be twice as good as a man in order to be thought half as good, but that fortunately that's easy. And my mother raised us with role models like that to believe that girls could do anything. So I didn't have, I knew that that it wasn't a universally accepted proposition, but I believed in myself. And so I spent a lot of my youth trying to figure out how I could do that. And then when I was in high school, I was the first girl to be elected student council president of my high school. I discovered that I could move people when I spoke, which was sort of scary, but also interesting. So I kind of saw that other people saw me as a leader, but it wasn't clear to me. And politics wasn't the thing that I thought of, because I lived far from the capital of the country. My parents voted, but they weren't involved in politics. So the long answer to a short question is I'm not really sure how I got there.
Well, I think you pinpointed it. You said it was something inside of you that was an intention to do something to stop the scourge of war and suffering. That was the seed that I picked out of that. And that intention, I think, many people have that intention, but they don't feel courageous enough to step into bringing it into action. And they're frustrated. And that's one of the functions that I think of great leaders like yourself, that they empower other people to step out. And as I've looked at your career, I've seen all of these organizations, which we'll get into, that you've helped spawn, that have not been centered really around you, but have been centered around giving voice to many other people, creating forums in which other people with the same intention can be more collectively effective.
Jonathan, I in my first career, I was a Soviet specialist before I studied the law. And I spent 3 months in the Soviet Union in 1972. Which was quite a revelation to me to see. I often say I went from studying the not law to studying the law. And I think one of the things that I have to say is when people say, oh, you were so brave to do these things, because I grew up in a democracy with the rule of law, I never had to be as brave as the people who are fighting these tyrannical governments, who are fighting authoritarian governments, or even who had to go to war in World War II to fight fascism. And so in many ways, I feel a little bit of a fraud if people say, well, you were brave, because I think I've never had to be that brave. And I'm so full of admiration for people who put their lives on the line, the Soviet dissidents, who were so important in the whole building of things like samizdat, and how do people communicate in a country where they're not allowed to? And of course, people say, well, the Soviet Union, they have a constitution. Yeah, they have, lots of authoritarian countries have laws. The question is, what kind of laws are they? And there was a catch-22 in their constitution that said that citizens enjoy their rights in exchange for performing their obligations or responsibilities, which is sort of like, these are not inalienable rights. These are quids pro quo for behaving yourself. So I think that my opportunity to see what other people were prepared to put on the line really inspired me to do whatever I could, but always conscious of the fact that I had never been called upon to make the kinds of sacrifices that the real heroes have made. And you and I both know these people, and I think are both inspired by what they do. And any way that we, from the comfort of our democratic societies and protection of the rule of law, anything we can do for them is small.
We'll just jump right into it because it's such an important subject, and we'll come back to your history a little bit later, because I know this is a passion of yours and mine. A few years ago, I was asked to advise the Civic Chamber of Russia. The Civic Chamber, and the head of it began and explained that after the end of the Cold War, they had licensed over 200,000 civil society organizations, that they'd studied the robustness of civil society in the West and how effective and important it was. So in Russia, if you want to start a bowling league or a political party, you need to get permission from this committee. So he asked me, how do you ensure that civil society is of benefit to the security of the state in the United States? And I was struck by that. And I realized that I said, I have no experience in that equation. I could tell you how we in the United States, particularly lawyers through the rule of law, work assiduously to ensure that the state is a benefit to the security of civil society. Because where I come from, the government is the employee and the people are the employer. And I realized that the elderly people in that committee didn't disagree with me. They really didn't grasp what I was talking about. They did, because they didn't see that rights were inalienable and began with the individual. They saw rights as coming from the state. And we know that the rights are inherent in our humanity. And today we have at least 5 aspiring authoritarian empires in the world. Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran are aspiring empires. And we have authoritarian leaders in many countries, Brazil, Philippines. We just had a president in the United States who was an authoritarian model of governance. What do you think are the antidotes to this very dangerous dynamic of authoritarian governments, in which it is presumed by authoritarian leaders that rights come from the state and that they're licensing them out to the people, which means they can be taken away, which we're seeing, for example, in Hong Kong today?
Well, I think there's 2 things. One is to push back against fundamentalisms or authoritarian ideologies. I mean, the whole basis of Marxism, Leninism, that moved on just from Marxism, was that the Lenin's conception of the party, that the party governs not because people below have chosen it, but because it represents that group that has the highest level of consciousness. And therefore, they know better than the people what they want. It's like Rousseau's comment that a man shall be forced to be free because there's a general will, there's somebody who knows better. And that model of governance is very dangerous, because what it suggests is that there are people who have access to some higher truth that justifies their exercising power at whatever cost to the freedom of ordinary people. And sometimes when people are frightened, they are susceptible to simplistic explanations of the world that make some of it seem sense, and they are prepared often to surrender up their own liberties in exchange for some kind of security. But those regimes always lead to disaster. And it's interesting, I watch these. I've been watching a lot of documentaries on Netflix during COVID. And, you look at documentaries about the people around Hitler and whatever. I mean, in all of these countries, you may have very talented people who are serving a dictator. But what becomes very clear at some point is, however talented and smart they are, whatever they know, it's irrelevant, because the only value that counts is what the dictator wants and what makes him happy. So it doesn't matter what kinds of people he gathers around. And so eventually smart people don't want to gather around because they can't do anything. And that's a model that's really, really very frightening. So I think pushing back against belief systems that have simplistic and kind of all-encompassing explanations for everything, but also having faith in people. It's very easy to believe that the world is full of people who aren't very smart or whatever. One of the interesting things about being a politician is that I think, well, with the exception of maybe some of the people in your country who don't seem to be all that in touch with people, but my experience was that I and my colleagues, we tended to be kind of positive about human nature, because when your job is to serve people, you meet lots of people who have issues that they need you to address. And you meet people who are living heroic lives, often under difficult circumstances. And I think even going back to my first political job as a school trustee, and parents who have children with learning disabilities are passionate about giving them the right opportunities because they know how important that is. And people would come and see me about some way that could the school system help? And I would think, this is my problem Wednesday from 4 to 5. It's their problem 24/7. And these are people who are so passionate and devoted to doing right for their children. And they were so admirable. And just so many issues that I got involved in. I met people living really heroic lives under difficult circumstances. Did you realize that the capacity of human beings to be strong and smart and kind is really enormous? But if you have a very pessimistic view, if you are cynical, then it's easier again to play into things which deny people their right to be fully fledged participants in society. Because you say, well, what do they know? And then, and you're seeing some of this now, people talking about, validating or defending voter suppression laws. Well, only the right people should vote. Well, you know what? Who are those people? Because there are a lot of, I think after the financial collapse of 2008, a lot of very expensively educated people made a lot of bad decisions that ruined a lot of people's lives. So I think it's understanding that talent and character and integrity and energy are found everywhere. And if you keep your eyes open and look for them, you will be able to be, you'll want to create a society that lets all of that play out and have its effect. So that's I guess it's a long answer to a short question, Jonathan, because if there were easy answers, we wouldn't have had some of the political problems we have. But fundamentalist religion, religious doctrines, political ideologies, or even conceptions like white supremacy or misreadings of our own history. Even the narrative of our history is often very important, that people distort that narrative to try and ascribe virtue and special qualities to certain people as opposed to others. So, how we think and how we think about other people is really fundamental to our willingness to live in an open participatory society.
Well, in preparation for today, I read many of your speeches, which I commend to everyone's attention at Kim Campbell's website. And in one of them, you cited Hannah Arendt on the subject, in which she said that one of the origins of totalitarian tyranny takes root in societies where people come to believe that nothing that they hear is true or false, that they lose confidence in the media's, or that truth even matters, facts matter. And we've just lived through several years of a leader of the United States who was very loose with facts, and in fact even challenged the validity of the last election, challenged it publicly, continues to challenge it, and challenged it in our courts. But I'm really proud to be an American lawyer, because I believe that our legal system passed the stress test, that when issues came before courts where truth does matter, over 60 cases said the truth matters, Joe Biden's going to be president. And I think that lawyers that litigated those cases are really heroes. And the judges, 201, did not compromise the principles of the rule of law. And, I know that you were the Minister of Justice in Canada, and you were the Attorney General. So in your career, this theme has been very, very important. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how it became important to you and why you think it's important today.
Well, I think the rule of law is the foundation stone of democracy. Sometimes people say, well, it's elections, but a lot of countries have elections and they, choose who's going to oppress them for the next few years. But the rule of law, and what it really means, that everyone is subject to the law, is fundamental. But even so, as any human institution, nothing survives on autopilot. And what became very clear to me, and what I learned a lot about, was how we make the laws matters a great deal. The law is not some kind of Olympian thing that comes down from on high. It is a human creation, and it is created. The people who create it have to have the values and the knowledge and the understanding to create laws that will aspire to some kind of justice. And so, as the first woman to be Minister of Justice in Canada, the Minister of Justice is responsible for legislating the criminal law. And our criminal law is a federal jurisdiction, so we only have one criminal code in the whole country. So it's a very powerful and important position. And I wanted to mark the fact that I was the first woman. So I convened a national symposium on women, law, and the administration of justice. And I had wonderful people in the department that went across the country and talked to people and say, if you were at such a meeting, what should be on the agenda? So we really reached out to find out where are the areas that people felt that the law was perhaps not serving women. And it was an amazing conference, and it was very generative of new ideas in the law. But what was interesting is that quite a few judges attended. And when the minister is convening something, they know that their judicial independence will be protected, so they could come, and they're very curious. And after several of them said words to the effect of, before I came, I thought I was very liberal on these issues, and I realized I didn't know anything. So here were judges who were, in a sense, a self-selected group who were interested in issues relating to women and the law, who were a little bit horrified to discover that there were many assumptions they had, or many areas that they weren't really knowledgeable, hadn't really thought about. So the law is something that we have to constantly challenge for its inclusivity, for the wisdom of its vision. And so there, for example, I rewrote the sexual assault law in Canada. We recreated the rape shield provisions, and incidentally, always with the idea of never denying an accused a full and fair defense. I mean, always that balance, because if you don't have that balance, then the law will not have support. I passed a very significant piece of firearms legislation, and gun control is a contentious issue in Canada as well. At that time, in the early 90s, we were still far away from recognizing, for example, same-sex marriage. We were still pretty backward on LGBTQ issues, but I brought in amendments to the Canadian Human Rights Act to make sexual orientation a prohibited ground of discrimination. So we always have to push. We always have to say, who is not being included in this vision? Whose voices aren't we hearing? And it's interesting because several years later, the second woman to have been Minister of Justice in Canada became minister, and she mentioned later at a speech when we were on a panel together that she was briefed on the Campbell mode of consultation. And what that was, and what the department said was that I went far beyond the traditional approach to consultation when I was creating new legislation, that it wasn't just the usual suspects, like, the Canadian bar and lawyers, whatever, but that I would go out and try and talk to people. For example, when we were doing the sexual assault law, I was in Toronto and I was meeting with women in the sex trade and women of color, and women who are in communities where people make assumptions about them and about the role of sexual violence in their society, all sorts of things. So I thought it was really very sweet of her to acknowledge that, but that my approach to a broader form of consultation was still remembered at the department, and she followed the same pattern. So I think, again, that was one of the advantages of my not being one of the usual suspects, not being a prototypical person in that position, that I brought a different set of questions. And there are many more people. I mean, I can't speak for all women, not by any stretch of the imagination. So if we see the law as something that is not only the protection of our liberties, but an aspiration to reflect our highest principles. And if we understand that we're going to fall short on that, but that we must keep trying, and that means listening, it means empowering people, it means recognizing the value of people not like us and what they have to offer, then the rule of law becomes such a great and wonderful thing. It is the cocoon that enables us each to be who we want to be and to make our contribution. And when you're in a country that isn't ruled by the rule of law, and where people have to be frightened, even to raise questions, that is a terrible thing. It is soul destroying, and it is just so destructive of the human potential. And and that's why countries that don't have that kind of freedom don't produce the same kind of innovation. And it's not, I mean, I think a country like Russia is full of smart people up the wazoo, but the ability to be able to pursue things, to pursue knowledge without fear is so important. And the rule of law and our protection of our rights is part of that. It's a tile in that mosaic that's really important.
And this organization that you're addressing has a mandate to do this. And I'm really pleased that this is something that the American bar takes seriously, because it is being challenged. So with such a frontal assault, the very foundation of the transfer of power is being challenged.
Jonathan, I think that, particularly given the nature of the American Constitution, Canada, when we brought in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1983, expanded this form of litigation too. But I think all of us who believe in human rights and the rights of speech and somebody, and all of the fine-tuned parts of it that sometimes makes some people uncomfortable, because sometimes for freedom of speech you have to hear a lot of unpleasant speech. But I think the American legal profession has played such an important role, not just in the United States, but for the world, in using the tools of litigation, of using the tools of the courts, the tools of the law, to expand people's rights, to expand the way courts will view plaintiffs will view the people before them in terms of what they're entitled to. So I think in many ways, if you could give sort of a hero's medal to an organization, the American Bar Association and your members really deserve it, because I think in the context of modern history, so many of the victories that have then inspired other countries, and they may have followed them in Canada, we may have followed it with legislative change or whatever, but that have inspired other countries to protect rights and to enshrine them in legal protections, have come from the battles fought by American lawyers in American courts, often in very unpopular cases, often in the face of a great deal of opposition and hostility. And so I say, hats off to you. And that's why I'm very happy to address you, because I have such a special place in my heart for lawyers. And I think whatever kind of law we practice, and even if we're doing something that is, not necessarily very sort of socially aware or whatever, and however we're practicing or teaching or adjudicating, we're all stewards of the legal system. Those of us who have the privilege to study the law and know what it is and see how the pieces fit together. When the chips are down, we should see ourselves as the stewards of something very important.
Well, your sense of stewardship of the fundamental rights of individuals, you walked that walk when you were the Minister of Indian Affairs, of interacting and helping to change the whole dialogue toward Indigenous people in Canada. But this idea of challenging the cynicism that is so dangerous, where people are afraid to speak because they have no context and they become cynical. The power of the moral vision of we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal. When it was stated that ought was hardly and is. You didn't have full citizenship if you didn't own property, even if you were white and skin privileged. If you were a person of color, you were part of the United States, you weren't a person. And women, it wasn't even a discussion. Pardon?
If you were a female, you were seriously out of luck.
Yeah, I was about to say, if you were a female, you weren't even in the discussion, except for maybe, Adam's wife. But the power of ought has been a compelling magnet for justice and social change. And that principle of the equality of people, that is fundamentally always challenged by the hierarchies of authoritarian regimes. And I noticed that one of the activities that you were involved in was teaching leadership skills. You started a program in a university on leadership, and that you gave two models of leadership: interactive and hierarchical. So I wonder if you could talk about what you've learned about the qualities of leadership. And I want to, just before you get into that, I want to say I've seen you interacting with world leaders. I think we met, I know we met together in San Francisco with Mikhail Gorbachev, who's been a great leader in both of our lives. Oscar Arias, we met with him. I was able to observe in a meeting when we were lobbying your successor in the Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, which we'll talk about that meeting and the subject matter. The extremely professional and cordial and substantive interchange, and I think about where we are today in the way leaders are talking to one another, and how important it is that those principles of respect and interaction and dignity of each individual come back into the political dialogue. But if you could talk a little bit about these models of leadership and how you set up a program to teach it.
Well, I was invited by the University of Alberta which is one of the big 5 Canadian universities. Although I never went there and I had not spent much time in Alberta, I was invited to come and create a leadership college in honor of a former premier of Alberta, Peter Lougheed, who had been an extraordinary leader. And I won't go into his history, but he was really a remarkable man. So it was the Peter Lougheed Leadership College. And I had spent time at the Kennedy School in the Center for Public Leadership when it was first created. And that was my first exposure to people who did leadership as an academic process. And I taught a course called Gender and Power, and there was a lot of very interesting literature coming out, sort of too late for me, unfortunately, but coming out about gender barriers and how they work, and all sorts of, how the way we think isn't really how we think. There's all sorts of research on how we make decisions and how we think about things. And again, different models of leadership: hierarchical, command and control style leadership, interactive leadership, collaborative leadership. But I think what was interesting was that I felt that this program, which was to be for what we call 3rd and 4th year students, you call them sophomores and juniors and seniors, that people would say, well, how can you teach leadership? I mean, can leadership be taught? And I'd say, what all leaders are taught. All leaders are the product of all sorts of formative experiences. They're products of their formal education, they're products of their socialization, they're products of their families, everything. None of us is a blank slate. And the real question is, are those of us who have the opportunity to lead, have we been taught the right things? Do we have the skills that we need, both to achieve goals, but also to do it in a way that is fair and just and socially constructive and effective? And so I thought, what you can teach young people, because we don't know what they're going to be, we don't know what they're going to do, but what we can do is we can give them the skills to be self-aware, to understand, and as I say, the way we think isn't really necessarily how we think, that we're all, the custodians of all sorts of implicit attitudes, and we have all sorts of things that have influenced us. And if we can become more self-aware about how we think, also, if we can understand the barriers to good decision making that have been identified, whether it's Daniel Kahneman and all these people, but also one of the things that I felt, and one of our orientations was on the theme called learning and unlearning. And one of the things I realized as I get older is how many things I've had to unlearn in my life, things that I thought were true that weren't really true. And I think how can students broaden their values and their awareness? So one of the things we did was we organized them in the most diverse groups we could create. We kind of created these small forums that were really engineered for conflict. We, different students were from 10 different faculties of different faculties, different backgrounds, etc. And what was interesting was how in each of these forums, the students bonded like crazy and became sort of lifelong friends. But one of the things that the students have said about the program that they liked the most was the chance to work and study with students not like themselves. They understood what a gift that was, not just to see the paradigms of other disciplines, how other people approach problems, but to get to know people who weren't like them. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you think of what are some of the fundamental ways that leaders can be effective, that make good leaders, it is that moving that urge towards wisdom, which is not just a function of knowledge, it's a question of how you process things. But the more you can be exposed to the richness of human beings, the richness of human potential, which is why one of the things that concerns me a lot, and that I'm trying to think of what my next project is, but I really believe that the narratives that we have about our societies and our cultures are really important for determining our values. And a lot of our narratives are very wrong or incomplete. And I think about the narratives about women and the contributions that they make. I mean, people who think, well, people would say to me when I was young, well, Kim, you're smart, but where's the female Einstein? Well, now you discover there's actually all sorts of them. And a few years ago, the New York Times created a new feature in its obituary column called Overlooked No More. And they said, since 1850, we've been publishing articles about basically white men. And there are all sorts of people whose lives deserve to be written about. So they've gone back in American history, not just American history, but largely American history, and written about men and women and people of color and people from all sort of unprepossessing backgrounds who did amazing things, who lived wonderful lives that deserve to be celebrated. And I think this is so important because it challenges us. When I saw that movie, Hidden Figures, and I was furious, I thought, why don't I know about these 3 African-American women, mathematicians, computer scientists, who were integral to the building of the American space program. Why don't I know about them? I am robbed of the role models that I need to erode the kind of comfortable, kind of casual bigotries that I have as a result of the narrowness of my own life experience. So going back to this idea of leadership, the more you can broaden people's appreciation for all the different kinds of people who do great things and all the different places in which you will find intelligence and value and courage and ideas and human qualities and warmth and kindness, the better you are equipped to create a vision for whether it's your organization or your country of where you should go and how to get there, how to draw on the resources that will enable you to get there. So my approach to teaching leadership was to try and create that sense of self-awareness, that sense of appreciation of difference. But also we did things like, for example, in the second year of the program, the students all had to do a capstone project under the supervision of the Faculty of Science. And the first year they had to learn to write, and all these engineers and scientists saying, oh, we don't want to have to write. And at the end they say, thank you for making us write, because now they were writing marvelous letters of application and getting into Yale Medical School and things like this. But the second year they did a program where they had to do a project that was based on science. So all the humanities and art students were going, oh, what are we going to do? But I thought, what do you need to be a leader? We asked the question, what do leaders need to know? Well, I think to be an intelligent, discerning consumer of scientific research is fundamental. And we've seen this in the course of COVID. If people don't have a clue of what science is, what the scientific method is, what the significance is of science, it costs a lot of lives. So again, my approach to teaching leadership is, look, I don't know what the students are going to do, but equip them with the knowledge and understanding that will enable them to navigate the shoals of a complex and difficult society and know who to ask for help, know how to reach out. You don't necessarily know the answers, but at least know the questions. So was my approach to creating a leadership college. And the students seem to have enjoyed it very much and have been very successful. Our first 2 graduating classes actually had a Rhodes Scholar in each of them, which was sort of interesting. So
That's proof.
it's funny because they can communicate so well. They're just so articulate and prepared.
Several years ago, I was teaching international law at Widener Delaware Law School. And it was a small class, only 12 students, very self-selective. And I immediately divided the class into 4 groups of 3, and I gave them issues that they would have to do brief and debate 2 weeks hence. So they came in and they were prepared to argue one side of the case. And then and each semester I would say, I changed my mind. I think you have to argue the other side's case, not the case you prepared. Or if you were good, you prepared to argue both sides. And inevitably, there were some students who said, I never prepared and analyzed the other side. To which I said, unless you know the other side's point of view as well as your own, you will never be a good lawyer. You'll never be a good negotiator. You'll never be a good spouse. You'll never be a good citizen. And you'll never be a full human being unless you respect and learn the point of view of others. And I viewed that as something that was really of great benefit in the discipline of law, that in an adversarial system, you better respect your adversary's arguments or you're going to lose. And that skill, it seems to me, describes what you called interactive leadership, really getting down and interacting with other points of view. And I saw this documentary of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and how important it was for him when he was in Warm Springs, Georgia, at a place in which he was interacting with other people who were disabled. And that somehow that opened up his sense of empathy and his sense of connectivity with common humanity that was really authentic, and how much good came out of that. And I think it's really important that leaders understand that they're really the employees. They're not the employers. And that's a moral vision. You know, that's a human vision. And in your speeches, I saw several issues in which you made the point that addressing, and I'll just list some of them where I saw this: gender equity, nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament, climate change, cybersecurity, and counterterrorism. Addressing these are both moral and practical imperatives. And that really struck me. This insight that there's an imperative that includes the moral and the practical. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you came to emphasize that point in so many of your speeches.
Well, you know, I think part of it is that arguing moral issues is not always the most effective way to get people's attention if what you're asking them to do is move their position from one that they're comfortable in, or that maybe to a position that they think is not as consistent with their interests. So when you can create the practical arguments as well to point out the very practical reasons why making these changes and recognizing these principles matters to things that are easier for them to relate to. Because I think also people don't want to feel like they're bad. And I always, say when I would talk about things like, implicit attitudes, or even my own discussions about learning and unlearning, I can be sort of horrified looking back and thinking of, some of the casual attitudes I had that were just ignorant and very, exclusionary. And I don't have those now. But nobody wants to be told that they're a bad person. How do you get them into a position where you're saying, well, the way you thought before is not really very helpful. And it's not actually supported by evidence, or negative things come from that kind of an approach. So for example, now with the advancement of women, the advancement of women should always have been, part of our sense of human dignity, that we are all equal. But it's easier to argue when you can say that the advancement of women contributes to social, political, and economic development, so much so that Pew Research has said that the most important indicator of the social, political, and economic advancement of a society is the status of its women. That you simply cannot create those values that we all believe in if women are not educated, empowered, protected, etc. So when we can talk about it in those ways, it's sometimes easier for people to say, oh, yes, well, we should do more of this. But if you just say, people who, this is a moral imperative, and people say, well, does that mean that I was a bad person? Or in other words, it's really just the practical, art of persuasion, in the same way that one of the best ways of persuading somebody to change their mind is to find somebody who used to hold their point of view, who's changed their mind to do it. Because they'll say, okay, I trust that person because they used to be in my position, and now they're explaining to me why they've decided that maybe that wasn't the best position to be in, as opposed to somebody who was never in that frame of mind and who might be seen as some kind of, ideological enemy, or, a person who's, dogmatic in some other way. So I think that so many of the things, we shouldn't have to make those arguments in a way, but at the end of the day, nuclear proliferation has the possibility to blow us up. Climate change is going to kill us, destroy our planet. So the fact that we have a moral obligation to cherish and steward the natural environment, a lot of people aren't comfortable with that vocabulary, even though they may go to a place of great beauty and feel an almost spiritual connection and joy with seeing it. Other arguments are more persuasive. So I think actually when you're in public life in particular, you come to understand that you need to reach to where people are and find those interests that they are comfortable responding to without making them feel defensive about their own moral standing. Because as I say, I don't think anybody, maybe with the exception of your recent president, who wants to be a bad person,
He doesn't seem to care. But I do think most people do care very much about what is morally correct. Uh, they're willing to give blood and treasure over values to spread democracy and fight tyranny. That's been a theme, at least in America, for our
What
soldiers. They
that
have a moral
means is
vision.
different people too, as
Yeah.
you will agree.
Of course, and people's morality can differ, but the issues that you raised of the climate, which inextricably is connected to the health of the oceans, which provides 50 to 70% of our oxygen through phytoplankton. If there was ever anything where it was obvious that there's a practical necessity, it's there. But I think the moral argument that the natural world is gifted to us, it's not an externality. It's not, the creation is not simply a resource for business. It's a gift of life itself. The human rights to a clean environment. This is a right that's right both in the sense of like a property right, but it's a moral right. And then I think we're sort of at a moment where the whole world, because of the pandemic, is realizing that there's a set of global existential threats.
But can I just make a point of this, Jonathan, because you're very right. But just going back to who our audience is and our wonderful American lawyers who've made such a difference in the world. And I think you're going to make an important difference in some of these issues as well, because one of the ways, if you can get people who don't have that moral vision and who don't really care that they're, filling the oceans with plastic and doing stuff, one of the resources is, again, to go back and use the law to sue people, to hold them accountable. And we've seen this, whether it's the tobacco industry, and now, these move around. It's not that these are clean and easy fights, but what I'm saying is that sometimes, and I've said this about climate change, I keep saying it's going to come down to the money. As investment funds start pulling their money out of fossil fuel industries, as these things very often are what force people to find another path, to do something different. Now, sometimes they find something else that's equally damaging and terrible as well. But again, this is where the law and the values that we create in the rule of law about holding people accountable for harm, that these are tools that sometimes when people will not respond to moral vision, these tools can force people to change the way they behave. And I think they're really important because, as I say, preaching to people who just either don't care or again, are not sufficiently scientifically literate or don't want to be, to be persuaded by the arguments of the danger of what they're doing. Sometimes, a good old lawsuit will accomplish a great deal.
And the importance of hearing other points of view cannot be overemphasized. And right now, the political dialogue has been reduced largely to name calling. And I don't think people appreciate that Richard Nixon brought us the Environmental Protection Agency, talking about that, or the National Environmental Protection Act, or the Biological Weapons Convention, or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or that Ronald Reagan was instrumental in the Montreal Protocols to protect the ozone layer and did more to eliminate nuclear weapons than any other president we've ever had, except for maybe his successor, George Bush Sr. That on some of these larger existential issues, there has been a bipartisan consensus. And I think it's really important to come back to that, because part of the fundamental is using science to address these issues. And science is based on facts. It is a fact that we cannot destroy the climate of the planet. And it is a fact that if we used less than 1% of the nuclear weapons in the world, we would we would throw sufficient soot, millions of tons of soot into the stratosphere and destroy agriculture. And
although we might cool the world down while we did it. So
yes, that's right. We would solve global warming.
Yes.
But I remember you gave a talk on this subject where you were talking. I think it was at the United Nations where you were talking about the nuclear issue as in terms of nonpartisan, that it was a nonpartisan issue. And and
It's a
you said it was a smart
debt issue, yeah.
it
It's
was a
not
smart
right,
dumb issue.
yeah.
But I've been thinking about all of these issues come down to a human security approach to security, rather than, because all of these issues require multilateralism. They require global cooperation. And that's been a theme that you advanced through the Club of Madrid with world leaders and so much. If you could talk a little bit about the human security approach to security.
Well, I think at the end of the day, the human security approach is also something that makes these issues real for ordinary people. When you talk big strategic concepts, and when I became defense minister, I mean, people were sort of surprised that actually, a lot of my knowledge was out of date because I knew a lot about the whole nuclear strategy thing, but which happily by that time in 1993 was becoming less necessary. But I think that human security is what brings the impact of these other decisions down to the regular ordinary person, to their understanding. And at the end of the day, it really does matter how individual people are able to live. And sort of the fundamental morality of allowing people to live their lives and make their choices. And yes, they have to, obey the law and, not drive drunk and steal things and whatever. I mean, it's not that we don't have a world of legal obligations, but all of these big issues boil down to individual lives and the inability often of individual people to have any say over big forces. I mean, we think of what's happening in Syria, but I mean, it is so just unacceptable that people could be victimized by forces beyond their control. So if we care about these big issues, it's because we understand at the end of the day, real flesh and blood human beings are affected by these decisions. They're not abstract exercises. And so human security keeps our values focused on the ultimate human goal of all of these decisions that we're making.
I looked at the offices you've held from beginning, and it's such a beautiful progression from being on the city school board in Vancouver, and then being in the federal legislative system, and then having these ministerial posts, and then being the prime minister, and then creating a leadership group of global leaders, and then bringing it back to this point that you've just made. It's how each of us lives our daily lives. And I think that grounding in compassion toward other people is the most important characteristic of leadership, and oddly enough, of the most effective lawyers, because they understand what's happening with people. Yeah. And I want to give you the closing remark on something that all lawyers in America should hold dear to them.
Well, just that you're part of something so much bigger. And every day you go to work, you do whatever you do. And sometimes you may like your job or not like your job. But it is such a privilege to be able to be part of the legal profession in a country that has a rule of law, but that you always have to fight for it. There's never a day you can go to bed and pull the covers over your head and say it's all going to work on autopilot now. There's a constant need to refresh and guard and protect. But I'm very proud to be a lawyer. It's something that matters to me. I feel I mean, sometimes people say, well, yeah, people have a law degree, it makes them obnoxious. Well, yeah, sure it does. We can get argumentative. But it makes you part of a club wherever you go in the world. You have something in common with lawyers, even in parts of the world where they don't get to do a great deal, or they have a lot of constraints. But it's a very special club, I guess. And I want to say again, a particular thanks to what the American legal profession has done in the course of centuries, but of course, particularly, I think, in the last few decades, 20th century, to help to establish standards of legal protections that other countries have emulated and brought into their own laws. So you are leaders in the world yourself, even when you're doing your work at home. So thank you. And as a Canadian, I'm very happy to be your neighbor.
Prime Minister Kim Campbell, thank you so much for absolutely inspiring sharing with us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.